All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. So, Super Eagles striker Victor Osimhen is finally set to leave Napoli for good, this time around on a permanent basis to join Galatasaray Football Club after both clubs, Napoli and Galatasaray, agreed a deal to sign Victor Osimhen on a permanent basis. It's reported to be worth up to 80 million euros, 75 million uh, euros as the base transfer fee. Then there was an extra possibility of 5 million euros for add-ons, depending on if Osimhen performs well, by scoring goals for this season. And this transfer is also set to make a number of history. For the Turkish Super League, he will be the most expensive player to ever be brought into the league, and also for Galatasaray, is going to set the record as the highest um the player with the highest amount of transfer that is being brought into the club in its entire um, history. And then for Napoli, it's going to be the second biggest transfer sale ever for the club after Higuain, broke the record when he moved from Napoli to Juventus. So there's just been a lot going on within this deal. And I think the most important thing is going to be how it has now ended Victor Osimhen's frustration with the club, of course, because Napoli were really, really difficult to deal with, especially when you talk about the Osimhen deal. And right now he is going to leave for good. And there's also some really strange clause in it, which one of them is that Galatasaray are not permitted to sell Osimhen back into the Serie A club for the next 2 years. So Napoli do not want to see him in Serie A, at least for the next 2 years. And then there's also a sell-on clause for the future in the event that Osimhen is sold by Galatasaray. Uh, Napoli will make 10% of the sale in the future. It was initially Napoli was initially holding out for 20% of it, but at the end of the day, they cut it down to 10%. And then Napoli instead decided to add extra 5 million um, add-ons, in case of bonuses, performance bonuses. So that's why we are seeing it to be a deal that could potentially rise up to 80 million euros. But in the meantime, Gala have already made 40 million euros payment, which is like the upfront uh, amount to be paid. So the next thing for Osimhen is to travel to Turkey to do his medical and then sign the contract before linking up with the team for preseason. I'm just so glad that this has come to an end, finally, and then this man can move on since um, all of these clubs were all the top clubs in the EPL and also in Spain and the rest were pretending like Osimhen didn't exist. Uh, at the end of the day, it's a good move. He didn't want to join Saudi Arabia. He didn't want to join Al Hilal, and then he stood his ground to actually uh, make this one happen. We'll see what happens. Of course, Osimhen will not need to be struggling to settle down because he's already had a season of loan spell at the club. He did very well. Was arguably the best player in the league. Won a couple of accolades. Highest goal scorer, won the league. Things like that. So he's going to settle really well. Another deal that could potentially be working out in the next coming hours is also Ademola Lookman's future. He could very well be moving away from Atlanta this season because, of course, there have been a couple of clubs. Inter Milan showed previous interest in the last couple of hours, uh, agreeing a personal term with the player and then also contacting the club to make an official bid of around 40 million euros. But that's way below Atalanta's value of Lookman. I think they're, holding out for 50 million euros upwards. So it's very, very unlikely, except Inter will be willing to make that extra sacrifice, to pay the extra money on top of it. But in the meantime, there's still another club that have now showed interest in Lookman, and it's Atletico Madrid. This time they want to use money plus player to get Lookman, to get Atlanta to sell Lookman. They are reportedly lining up Samuel Lino, and then a 30 million euros combo to try to tempt Atalanta for this one. It also remains to be seen if Atlanta will be interested in this kind of deal, because obviously they are very particular with the money. They don't want to compromise on the money for any reason. But we'll see what happens in the next coming hours. Moving on, guys, the Super Falcons of Nigeria, of course, as you know, they have a date against their formidable opponent in the WAFCON competition. That's the Female African Cup of Nations. It's actually a semi-final clash coming up tomorrow, being Tuesday. It's going to be played around 5 p.m. So both teams have actually been training really hard ahead of the semi-final tomorrow. For Nigerian Super Falcons, they actually started their training yesterday afternoon, where they held some really tactical, uh, training. And from the look of things, we don't seem to have any injury issues, which is obviously going to be very vital heading into this game, because we're going to need all of our players fit and ready to get the results against a really strong South African side. Remember, they are the defending champions, so they are not to be played with. And we have a sort of history with this South African team, in terms of head to head. We are not really far apart. They've won us a couple of times, we've won them a couple of times, drawn a couple of times as well. So tomorrow's encounter is going to be very, very tasty and feisty. But another boost for the Super Falcons in their training ground is that they actually received the new training kit, which they had been expected on the last couple of days, which was apparently seized by the Moroccan clearance offices. Right now, it's been released, so they will be training with fresh new pairs of training kits, which obviously is going to go a long way to kind of give them that motivation and feel that they actually need, as they prepare for that game tomorrow.